In 1919, I happened to be in Chicago on my way to the Far East, and for reasons that have nothing to do with this narrative, I was staying there for 2 or 3 weeks. I had recently brought out the successful novel, and being for the moment news, I had no sooner arrived than I was interviewed. Next morning, my telephone rang. I answered. Elliot Templeton speaking. Elliot, I thought you were in Paris. No, I'm visiting with my sister. We want you to come along and lunch with us today. I should love to. He named the hour and gave me the address. I had known Elliot Templeton for 15 years. He was at this time in his late 50s, a tall, elegant man with good features and thick, waving dark hair, only sufficiently graying to add to the distinction of his appearance. He was always beautifully dressed. He got his haberdashery at Charvet's, but his suits, his shoes, and his hats in London. He had an apartment in Paris on the River Gauche and the fashionable Rue Saint-Guillemot. People who did not like him said he was a dealer, but this was a charge that he resented with indignation. He had taste and knowledge, and he did not mind admitting that in bygone years, when he first settled in Paris, he had given rich collectors who wanted to buy pictures the benefit of his advice. And when, through his social connections, he heard that some impoverished nobleman or English or French was disposed to sell a picture of first-rate quality, he was glad to put him in touch with the directors of American museums who, he happened to know, were on the lookout for a fine example of such and such a master. There were many old families in France and some in England whose circumstances compelled them to part with signed pieces of buhl or a writing table made by Chippendale himself, if it could be done quietly. They were glad to know a man of great culture and perfect manners who could arrange the matter with distinction. One would naturally suppose that Elliot profited by the transactions, but one was too well bred to mention it. Unkind people asserted that everything in his apartment was for sale, and that after he had invited wealthy Americans for an excellent lunch with vintage wines, 1 or 2 of his valuable drawings would disappear, or a marquetry commode would be replaced by one in lacquer. When he was asked why a particular piece had vanished, he very plausibly explained that he hadn't thought it quite up to his mark and had exchanged it for one of much finer quality. He added that it was tiresome always to look at the same things. We Americans, he said, like change. It is at once our weakness and our strength. Some of the American ladies in Paris who claimed to know all about him said that his family was quite poor, and if he was able to live in the way he did, it was only because he had been very clever. I do not know how much money he had, but his ducal landlord certainly made him pay a lot for his apartment, and it was furnished with objects of value. On the walls were drawings by the great French masters Watteau, Fragonard, Claude Lorraine, and so on. Savonnière and Aubusson rugs displayed their beauty on the parquet floors, and in the drawing room there was a Louis Quincy suite in petit point of such elegance that it might well have belonged, as he claimed, to Madame de Papanor. Anyhow, he had enough to live in what he considered was the proper style for a gentleman without trying to earn money, and the method by which he had done so in his past was a matter which, unless you wished to lose his acquaintance, you were wise not to refer to. Thus, relieved of material cares, he gave himself over to the ruling passion of his life, which was social relationships. His business connections with the impetuous great, both in France and in England, had secured the foothold he had obtained on his arrival in Europe as a young man, with letters of introduction to persons of consequence. His origins recommended him to the American ladies of title whom he brought letters, for he was of a old Virginian family, and though his brothers traced his descent from one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence. He was well favored, bright, a good dancer, a fair shot, and fine tennis player. He was an asset at any party. He was lavish with flowers and expensive boxes of chocolate, and though he entertained little when he did, it was an originality that pleased. It amused these rich ladies to be taken to bohemian restaurants in Soho or bistros in Latin Quarter. He was always prepared to make himself useful, and there was nothing, however tiresome, that you asked him to do for you that he would not do with pleasure. He took an immense amount of trouble to make himself agreeable to aging women, and it was not long before he was the household pet in many an imposing mansion. He amiably was extreme. He never minded being asked at the last moment because someone had thrown you over, and you could put him next to a very boring old lady and count on him to be as charming and amusing with her as he knew how. In 2 or more years, both in London, to which he went for his last part of the season, and to pay a round of country house visits in the early autumn, and in Paris, where he had settled down, he knew everyone whom a young American could know. The ladies who had first introduced him to society were surprised to discover how wide the circle of his acquaintance had grown. Their feelings were mixed. On the one hand, they were pleased that the young protégé had made so great a success, and on the other, a trifle nettled that he should be on intimate terms with persons with whom their own relations had remained strictly formal. Though he continued to be obliging and useful to them, they were uneasily conscious that he had used them as a stepping stones and to his social advantage. They were afraid he was a snob, and of course he was. He was a colossal snob. He was a snob without shame. He would put up with any affront. He would ignore any rebuff. He would swallow any rudeness to get asked to a party he wanted to go to, or to make a connection with some crusty old dowager of great name. He was indefatigable when he had fixed his eye on his prey. He hunted it with the persistence of a botanist who will expose himself to dangers of flood, earthquake, fever, and hostile natives to find an orchid of peculiar rarity. The War of 1914 gave him his final chance. When it broke out, he joined an ambulance corps and served first in Flanders and then in the Argonne. He came back after a year with a red ribbon in his buttonhole and secured a position in the Red Cross in Paris. By then he was in affluent circumstances, and he contributed generously to the good works patronized by persons of consequence. He was always ready with his exquisite taste and his gift for organization to help in any charitable function that was widely publicized. He became a member of the two most exclusive clubs in Paris. He was Sir Eliot to the greatest ladies in France. He had finally arrived.